The first day the Germans came into the city where the young woman lived, they took Jewish men and ordered them to gather the dirt on the streets with their hands. Then the Jews had to undress, and behind each Jew was a German soldier with a fixed bayonet who ordered him to run. This is from Holocaust, Massacres, Charles Reznikoff, Anthology of Modern American Poetry, edited by Carrie Nelson. Then the Jews had to undress. Behind each Jew was a German soldier with a fixed bayonet who ordered him to run. If the Jew stopped, he would be stabbed in the back with the bayonet. Almost all the Jews came home bleeding, among them her father. Later, after the German garrison had left the marketplace, large trucks were suddenly there, and about a dozen soldiers jumped off each truck in green uniforms with steel helmets. These were SS men. They went from house to house, and they took Jewish men, young and old, and brought them to the marketplace. Here the Jews had to hold their hands on the back of their necks. About 30 Jews were taken that day, among them the young woman's father. They were then put on one of the trucks and carried off. The young woman ran after the truck until she reached the woods in the neighborhood. There she found all the Jews who had been taken dead. They had been shot and were stretched out on the ground in a pattern. Jews and Poles in groups of 5. Jews and Poles in groups of 5, but Jews and Poles in separate groups. She kissed her father. He was ice cold, although it was only an hour after he had been taken. Her father had a shop for selling leather and was one of the notables in the Polish Jewish community when the Germans entered. They put their horses into the synagogue and turned it into a stable. On a Saturday afternoon, peasants from neighboring villages came to tell the Jews of the town that the Germans were killing Jews. They should run and hide. They should run away and hide. But the rabbi and the elders of the town thought running away useless. Besides, they thought the Germans might take a few of the young men to work for them, but that no one would be killed. The next day before sunrise, a Jew from a neighboring village ran into the town shouting, "Jews, run for your lives! Jews, run for your lives! The Germans are out to kill us." And the townspeople saw the Germans coming in. The young woman's grandfather said, "Run and hide, children, but I will stay. It will do no harm to me." Those who could hid in a neighboring forest. During the day they heard shooting, single shots and cries. But towards evening they thought the Germans would be leaving the town, and sure enough, peasants from the neighborhood met them and said, "You can go back now. The Germans killed everybody left behind." When the Jews came back, they found that the Germans had rounded up 150 Jews, including the rabbi and other notables. They told the rabbi to take his prayer shawl along, and other Jews had been gathered in the center of the town, and he was told to put on his prayer shawl and sing and dance. He would not, and was beaten up, and so were the other Jews. Then they were taken to the cemetery. Here a shallow grave had been dug for them. They were told to lie down in 4s and were shot, but her father remained behind in the town alive. He had said he was cutting the leather in his shop for shoes and was registered as a shoemaker. Later, the Germans went into town to take whatever they could find. The place was swarming with Germans, 4 or 5 to every Jew. Many were put upon a large truck. Those who could not climb on themselves were thrown on, and those for whom there was no room on the truck were ordered to run after it. All the Jews were counted, and the Germans searched for every missing person on their list. The young woman was among those who ran, her little daughter in her arms. There were those too who had 2 or 3 children and held them in their arms as they ran after the truck. Those who fell were shot right where they fell. When the young woman reached the truck, all who had been on it were down and undressed and lined up, the rest of her family among them. There was a small hill there, and at the foot of the hill a dugout. The Jews were ordered to stand on top of the hill. The 4 SS men shot them, killed each separately. When she reached the top of the hill and looked down, she thought she saw 3 or 4 rows of the dead already on the ground. Some of the young people tried to run, but were caught at once and shot right there. Children were taking leave of their parents, but her little daughter said to her, "Mother, why are we waiting? Let us run." Her father did not want to take off all of his clothes and stood in his underwear. His children begged him to take it off, but he would not and was beaten. Then the Germans tore off his underwear and he was shot. They shot her mother too, and her father's mother. She was 80 years old and held 2 children in her arms, and they shot her father's sister. She also had babies in her arms and was shot on the spot. Her younger sister went up to one of the Germans with another girl, one of her sister's friends, and they asked to be spared. Standing there naked before him, the German looked into their eyes and shot them both, her sister and the young friend. They fell embracing each other. The German who had shot her younger sister turned to her and asked, "Whom shall I shoot first?" She was holding her daughter in her arms and did not answer. She felt him take the child from her. The child cried out and was shot. Then he aimed at her, took hold of her hair, and turned her head around. She remained standing and heard a shot, but kept on standing. He turned her head around again and shot her, and she fell into the dugout among the bodies. Suddenly, she felt that she was choking. Bodies had fallen all over her. She tried to find air to breathe and began climbing towards the top of the dugout and felt people pulling at her and biting at her legs. At last, she came to the top. Bodies were lying everywhere, but not all of them dead, dying, but not dead, and children were crying, "Mama, Papa." She tried to stand up, but could not. The Germans were gone. She was naked, covered with blood, and dirty with the excrement of those in the dugout, and found that she had been shot in the back of the head. Blood was spurting from the dugout in many places, and she heard the cries and screams of those in it still alive. She began to search among the dead for her little girl, and kept calling her name, trying to join the dead, and crying out to her dead mother and father, "Why didn't they kill me too?" She was there all night. Suddenly she saw Germans on horseback and sat down in a field and heard them order all the corpses heaped together, and the bodies, many who had been shot but were still alive, were heaped together with shovels. Children were running about. The Germans caught the children and shot them too, but did not come near her, and left again. And with them the peasants from around the place who had to help, and the machine guns and trucks were taken away. She remained in the field stretched out. Shepherds began driving their flocks into the field and threw stones at her, thinking her dead or mad. Afterwards, a passing farmer saw her, fed her, and helped her join Jews in the forest nearby. Jewish women were lined up by German troops in charge of the territory, told to undress, and they stood in their undergarments. An officer, looking at the row of women, stopped to look at a young woman, tall, with long braided hair and wonderful eyes. He kept looking at her, then smiled and said, "Take a step forward." Dazed as they all were, she did not move, and he said again, "Take a step forward. Don't you want to live?" She took that step, and then he said, "What a pity to bury such beauty in the earth. Go, but don't look backwards. There is a street to the boulevard. Follow that." She hesitated and then began to walk as told. The other women looked at her, some no doubt with envy, as she walked slowly, step by step, and the officer took out his revolver and shot her in the back. The soldier doing the shooting was sitting at the narrow end of the pit, his feet dangling into it, smoking a cigarette, the machine gun on his knees. As each truck came, those who had been on it, Jewish men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress and put their clothing at fixed places, sorted in great piles. Shoes, outer clothing, and underwear. The SS man at the pit shouted to his comrade that he counted off 20, now completely naked, and told them to go down the steps cut in the clay wall of the pit. Here they were to climb over the heads of the dead to where the soldier pointed. As they went towards the pit, a slender young woman with black hair, passing a German civilian who was watching, pointed to herself and said, "I am 23. An old woman with white hair was holding a child about a year in her arms, singing to it and tickling it, and the child was cooing with delight, and a father was holding the hand of his little son, and the child about to burst into tears, speaking to the child softly, stroking his head and pointing to the sky. Bodies were soon heaped in the large pit, lying on top of each other, heads still to be seen and blood running over their shoulders, but some were still moving, lifting arms and turning heads. They gathered some 20 Hasidic Jews from their homes in the robes these wear, wearing their prayer shawls too, and holding prayer books in their hands. They were led up a hill. Here they were told to chant their prayers. Here they were told to chant their prayers and raise their hands for help to God. And as they did so, the officers poured kerosene under them and set it on fire.